Hi everyone, this is Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. Today I'm with Nick Chater, who is the author of the popular book The Mind is Flat, which I have with me here. In the book, he talks about how our mind is an imaginative storyteller, making up things as it goes along in life. What we perceive as deep thoughts or emotions are not views into our deep self, but rather a shallow surface level interpretation of whatever situation we find ourselves in. Nick is a professor of behavioral science at Warwick Business School and works on rationality languages using a range of theoretical and experimental approaches. He has over 200 publications, authored several books, has won 4 national awards in psychological research, and has served as an associate editor for journals in cognitive science, psychological review, and psychological science. So he has a lot of experience thinking about mind and everything related to it. So I'm quite excited to talk to him today. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Nick Chater.
Well, thank you very much, Paras. It's lovely to be here.
Great. So I wanted to start by the very sort of basic question. How did you get interested in studying the mind? What's your career trajectory that led you to writing the book?
Yes, that's a good question. So from the very beginning, I started my sort of academic life wanting to do mathematics and philosophy. So I started off doing mathematics at Cambridge. Then I switched to philosophy, thinking, well, there's not much logic and all those things that I thought were supposed to be philosophically important. Those didn't seem to be very well represented in the maths learning at Cambridge. Switched to philosophy. Then I took an option in psychology, which was one of the things we could do in our second year, and thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. Maybe I should do philosophy of psychology or philosophy of mind. And then having done that, I thought, well, this is really, really interesting. I'll then basically become a psychologist via really the route of cognitive science. So cognitive science is this approach to the mind where you're fundamentally thinking of the mind as an information processing machine. Obviously, sometimes that's put, including by me, as a computer metaphor for mind. You're thinking of the mind as a computer, but that's a bit misleading because it gives you the impression that the computers we actually build are a good model for how the mind works. And that's a bit like saying, if we think of the body as a machine, then thinking, well, if it's a machine, then it seems very different from a motor car or a I don't know, a pump or something. And of course, biological machines, biological computers are really far more sophisticated and remarkable than any others that we can actually build ourselves. But anyway, so the cognitive science approach is where I came from. I started to get very interested. I've always have been interested in sort of basic foundational questions. So where does knowledge come from? What does it mean to have a belief about anything? Where do the meanings of our words come from? How does it make sense? How does it even make sense to talk about the meaning of an utterance or a meaning of a thought? And rather latterly, I became very interested in decision making, also particularly relating to economic decision making. So there are a couple of routes into this book, apart from that sort of general trajectory of coming from sort of a mixture of science, mathematics, and philosophy. Into thinking about the mind. But two particular things. One is that coming from the computer metaphor perspective, thinking the mind is a kind of amazing biological computer, then a natural place to look for insights into how such a computer could work is looking at contemporary AI. So artificial intelligence, of course, is the attempt to make computers smart. So that must surely be relevant to giving us at least ideas. Some of them will be good ideas, some less good, but to give ideas about how we actually work. And that's a part of this general idea of what's called reverse engineering, as I'm sure you know, the idea that you're trying to understand a biological system by looking at engineered systems and trying to work out, well, what could the engineering principles be underpinning this biological system? Now, from an AI perspective, one of the things that people have tried to do in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s is to try to capture human intelligence by essentially capturing it in symbolic sort of linguistic terms. So the idea would be, very crudely, if I want to capture your expertise as a chess player, I say to you, well, what do you know about chess? And it's not quite as crude as that, but you think things like, queens are more important than bishops, and bishops are more important than pawns, and having the control of the center of the board is good, and having two bishops is in a pair working together, that's good as well. And so all of these things that chess players can say And the dream would be that you get all this information and you plug it into your sort of giant, very clever database, and you do lots of reasoning with it, and that will allow you to successfully play chess. Now, I've set that up in a way that you're automatically thinking, well, that's just never going to work, is it? And you'd be absolutely right. It never works. It doesn't just work for chess. It doesn't work really for any domain at all. So if you try to get people to say, what do you know about, everyday objects? What do you know about the liquids? How do they work? What do you know about trees? Tell us about this. And whatever people say about any domain at all, they're always incoherent. They're always the things they tell you always are contradictory with each other. That's the first thing. And the second thing, they have enormous gaps. There's just vast amounts of stuff that we just don't really have any thoughts about at all. And there, of course, an interesting example that's very sort of obvious when you think about it is the problem you have when young children ask you questions. So if anyone who's got a small child or encountered a small child with this quite phase of asking why questions, they're continually asking, why is the sky blue? Why whatever. I mean, almost every question they ask you, why doesn't electricity flow out of the plug socket when and it's kind of like, well, yeah, it's kind of not so obvious. And you realize that most of these questions you can't really answer. So the thought is that when you get people to explicitly say, as people in early artificial intelligence try to do, to get them to explicitly say what they know, and then you try to think of that as the basis for knowledge. It doesn't really seem to work very well. People don't seem to know very much, and what they do quote know is actually often self-contradictory. So that's one reason that people in that symbolic artificial intelligence tradition began to get worried. And I was watching that, thinking, there's something profoundly strange going on here, because this whole idea that our thoughts are basically stuff of the mind, basically sort of components, are fairly close to language. That seems to be under threat if it's the case that when you try to articulate your thoughts in language, you just can't do it. So that's one thing. So the AI computer metaphor of the mind, that's one inspiration for thinking about the mind is flat, is thinking, we intuitively think of our thoughts as all about, it's very close to language. I mean, I express my beliefs in words, I express my desires in words, and I feel I can justify them and explain them and so on. But actually, when you push that, when you try and turn that into something rigorous, as the AI people try to do, it just kind of falls to pieces. It just turns out to be a kind of tissue of confusion. So that's one thing. And the other thing, the thing I became interested in latterly, which also led me into writing this book, and it's really these two things coming together that sort of that made the book happen, is thinking about decision making and sort of classical rational models of decision making. And according to those rational models, it's very important that people have coherent preferences about what they prefer. So I want to have a model, if I'm a rational agent, in which if I prefer A to B and I prefer B to C, I jolly well better prefer A to C. I can't be in a world where I think A is better than B and B is better than C, but then C is better than A, because that's kind of going around in a circle. And in fact, if you do follow those circles, you get into a tremendous pickle for all sorts of reasons. So with a few very simple axioms, such as make sure your preferences don't go in circles, you can actually show, in theory, that a fully rational agent should be able to attach a number to each good or outcome, to say how much I like it. And then you should determine your behavior to try and, as it were, maximize these numbers. So the way you normally think of this is the numbers are things called utilities, and your job as an intelligent, rational agent, particularly in economics, is to maximize your utility, in fact, maximize your expected utility, and the expectation takes account of the fact that there's uncertainty. You never quite know what's going to happen for sure, so you just take the expected amount of utility. Now, that model, too, is another rational model of the world, and it seems to crash into the fact that every time you give anyone any kind of experimental test of their choices, they immediately violate the most basic rational, reasonable axioms. They're always saying they like A more than B, more than C, more than A. And they sometimes say, I prefer A to B. And a few seconds later, they'll say they prefer B to A. I mean, they just seem to be just all over the place. So you have the same kind of problem. So here we're not trying to formalize knowledge, we're trying to formalize choice. But you've got the same problem that you take a rational perspective. You think, well, a rational agent should follow these very, very strict rules. Then there'd be a real sense in which we had deep preferences, deep values we associated with things, and then we could kind of explain our behavior. But it always turns out that real behavior is just much more chaotic and capricious and variable. So I suppose that reflecting on the fact that the sort of intuition that one has when one's doing psychological experiments and just filling in questionnaires or doing anything, you have that kind of sense that I'm just making this up as I go along. I don't really know what I'm doing. And taking that seriously, thinking, oh yes, that's actually right. That's the sort of core idea for the mind. It's not that there is some deep basis of knowledge, a deep basis of values, preferences, and so on. That's the wrong way to think. You should think of us as fundamentally improvisers. And the reason we're incoherent, the reason we don't know half the answers to almost any problem is because we haven't improvised that yet. We're just skating from moment to moment.
Right. I guess, this really goes well with the experience where, economists and psychologists I don't know about psychology, but economists definitely believe there is some very clearly defined preferences deep inside people, and they are making choices by tapping into those preferences. But as you're saying, different experiments. And I think intuition also shows that we're not accessing something deep within us in terms of preferences. We're just making things as we go along. It is a not so very comfortable idea where I think our belief in having a deep self with core preferences, goals, desires, I think it's so well ingrained that it's hard to accept that there is no deep self. So how do you make peace with that? What do you recommend people to contextualize this?
It's a very good point, and I think it is. Rory Sutherland, who's the vice chairman of an ad agency, Ogilvy, but he's very interested in behavioral economics, and his view is that the thing about the mind is flat idea is that however right it may be, it's just got sort of a terrible marketing problem that we're just wired not to believe it. And I don't think this is what you're getting at, right? And I think there's something deeply right about that. I think it's the kind of thing that you can sort of on the one hand think this is a very weird idea, and this is almost exemplifies the flatness of the mind, the improvised nature of thought. Almost at the same time, you can think, well, this is totally obvious. So on the one hand, you can think, well, there's a real me, and I'm the real me. I don't necessarily know what that real me is. In fact, I may be even wanting to discover it. So I can have metaphors of, try to find out what I really want or who I really am, or voyages of self-discovery. The whole idea of self-discovery is quite a funny one, really, because it's as if you're sort of hunting about for yourself. You think, I'm in there somewhere. Maybe if I go on a long trip or I take up meditation or something, I'll find myself. And I don't think things like going for trips and going for long trips and taking up meditation is a bad idea. And it may well lead you to feel clearer than you were before. But I think the mistake is thinking, I found myself now. That was me before, and I've now found myself. The right thing to think is, I was confused, and I'm less confused now. I figured this out. So there's one side of us, I think, which feels very uncomfortable with the idea that fundamentally we're creators of ourselves rather than discoverers of ourselves. So I think the way we should, I think in some sense, it's both a disturbing and an empowering idea. The disturbing side of it is thinking, oh my goodness, it's just down to me just to wander off in any direction. That's a bit alarming. And I should come back to that because I think we haven't got quite as much flexibility as all that. But the positive side, of course, is that it means we are not trapped. If you think from a Freudian perspective, which is obviously not taken terribly seriously in modern psychology, but if you took a Freudian perspective on the mind, you'd have the feeling that there's a kind of inner, in fact, there are three inner parts to you: the id, superego, and the ego, who are sort of fighting for control. And what's going on with them is only sort of dimly visible to you. And your subconscious thoughts just kind of welling up from where the real action is, and you're kind of in the power of these sort of hidden forces. And I think that's a really, I think that's a kind of negative idea. I think, I don't think we should feel happy about that. So I think the fact that we have more control than we might think, I think that's something I'd like to think of that as a freeing, positive perspective, really.
So my takeaway from the book was, I think it depends how you define what self is. So if we imagine two alternatives, in one alternative, you have a perfectly coherent and consistent self, and you're just trying to scratch more and more layers to reach that self, uh, that doesn't that doesn't exist, according to what you write, and of course according to how our brain is architected, and a lot of evidence. But on the other hand, of course self exists, but self is just a collection of the memories and the patterns that are ingrained, which may not necessarily be consistent. So when you wrote about that metaphor in the book, as a novelist is writing, and even a greater novelist like Tolkien has inconsistencies in his work, I think that really drove home the point that the debate is really about consistency, whether our self is consistent, whether anything of such sort will exist or not.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm very fond of these sort of literary, as you'll have picked up in the book, for literary metaphors for the mind. I think it's a really helpful way to think. If you think about a novelist creating a fictional world, of course, in some sense, it's a very astounding intellectual achievement. But what they're not doing is discovering a world. It's not that Tolkien is finding out more about Middle Earth. He's creating Middle Earth, and of course he's going to be inconsistent in the way he does it. He's a very remarkably clever person, so he wasn't idiotically inconsistent. But like every other human being, it's impossible to be completely consistent. And of course, there'll also be huge gaps. There'll be huge things where you could say, well, how is this supposed to work in Middle Earth? Which the answer is, well, who knows? Who knows? There's no answer to that. And I think that's also true of our own vision of ourselves. So we have a story of our own lives and who we are and what we're trying to achieve and what's important to us. And this itself will also be continually. It's a sort of continual work in progress. It's not the finished novel. It's Tolkien, as it were, mid-draft. He's kind of still working on the project and going back and revising and changing. So not only is it inconsistent because everything any human being writes is going to be inconsistent. And full of gaps. It's also because the process of our constructing our own story is somehow is inevitably incomplete. But I think that's quite a cheering idea, really. In many ways, it's quite encouraging to think that if we're writing our own story, then we have some latitude about how we write it. Now, the thing you mentioned earlier, I think, is super important. The fact that there is a kind of way of thinking about selves, not as this kind of, what do I really believe? What do I stand for? What are my preferences? What do I really like? As if these things are stable. A different perspective is to say, well, actually, I am my history. Right? I am the history of all the things I've thought and done. And that things I've thought and done before will, as you were hinting, they will shape the way my mind works in the future. So it's not that I'm detached from all of this, unless I have some terrible amnesia. And even if I do, I'll still be somewhat influenced by my previous thoughts and actions. And in fact, when I encounter new situations, I'm going to be I have a strong tendency to draw on my past experience to deal with the new challenges. And that's so a very general point about the way the mind works, rather than having this sort of grand, unified understanding, which is supposedly perfectly consistent and coherent, is much more like working. It's much more like a legal system where we're always working case by case. So in common law legal systems, as you'll know, every case is judged independently, but it's judged by reference to previous cases, and those cases are judged by reference to previous cases. And every new case, they introduce new things and new adjustments and new explanations for why this case didn't actually turn out to be relevant after all, and why this case we thought was relevant, but we've now decided it wasn't. And so there's continual debate, but each case is being decided on the basis of past cases and is shaping future cases. So that a legal tradition is being formed. And what's not happening in particular is there aren't any general legal principles. You can't say, okay, in the common law system in whichever country, what are the basic principles from which everything follows? The answer is, well, there aren't any. So we can't figure that out. But there is a coherent system. And it will have contradictions and errors and mistakes. It won't be perfect. And when those things get noticed, they get fixed, and then new errors pop up. And that's again like our minds. We have particular thoughts on particular things. If you ask me about them, I think, I never think about this one. I've said that before. Or even if you just ask me, if I'm simply having to navigate my way around the house, I don't have to solve every navigational problem from scratch. I think, well, when I want to go to the kitchen, this is how I do it. Oh, a door, I'll I'll open it with the handle. This is stuff I've done before. So I'm always reusing my past thoughts and past actions to solve new problems. And that means, of course, that I'm different from you, and I'm different. We're all different from all other people on the planet because we have these different histories. So it's not at all to say that we're not individuals, or that our past doesn't shape us, because it really does shape us. But on the other hand, it does lead us to have a certain degree of flexibility. Because it's not that I can think anything or do anything from where I am, because I'm sort of a little stuck with my own history of thoughts and actions. But on the other hand, given those thoughts and actions, I can try to guide myself in one direction or another.
Right. When I was reading your book, again, another point that struck me was how much can we take people at face value when we ask them to explain their actions or behaviors? If they don't really have access to some true reason for why they did something, how do you really interpret the answer they are giving? How much of it is confabulation? And I think as a psychologist, I'm very curious when you get results from people in terms of their answers. What do you make of it?
Yeah, so this is a very central question for the topic of the book, of course. So my starting point is really quite a radical one. So not necessarily that unusual in parts of psychology, but from an everyday person's point of view, it seems like a really extreme statement, which I'm going to make, which is essentially it's all confabulation. So there's no ever, my claim would be in no point ever in human history has the human brain ever been able to look inside itself and say, I know what's going on. I know the reason for this thought. There it is. It just can't do that. That's just impossible. And in fact, there's more general thought, which is that we never know the origins of basically the workings of our own mental processes. What we do know are the outputs. So if you ask me a question and you say, what's the capital of France? And I say, Paris. And then you say, why did you say Paris? Well, the answer is, I just have no idea. It just came to mind. That's the answer, isn't it? I have nothing more to say. But what pops into my head is the answer to the question. Now, when you ask me a question like, I don't know, why did you get started in psychology? Or why did you write this book? I will then give you another. I will also give you an answer. But just as in the case of, if you ask me, what's the capital of France? And out pops an answer. All I'm aware of is what I'm saying. All I'm aware of is the answer I'm giving. Now you can ask me to justify that. You can say, well, hang on, is that really right? And you can ask me a follow-up question and another follow-up question. And I'll keep improvising answers. I'll make more answers up. But what I'm never able to do is to justify my answer by looking back and retracing my mental steps. I think basically the brain doesn't have the ability to introspect its own mental processes at all. So let me give you a couple of reasons why people think this. Not everybody, it's not universal in psychology, but plenty of us do. And one it comes from these extraordinary experiments by Michael Gazzaniga and others on people who have their brains split into two. Okay. So this is something that was done particularly in the sort of 50s, 60s and 70s as a treatment for epilepsy. So if you have very extreme epilepsy, one way of stopping the epileptic seizure from spreading across from one half of the brain to the other is to sever the connections between the two halves of the brain. So that you'll know that the brain is a sort of walnut-shaped thing with a corpus callosum, as it's called, this set of connecting tissue which connect the left and the right half together. So if you sever the corpus callosum, now the two halves of the cortex, at least the lower, the brainstem and so on, that's still unified. The two halves of the cortex can't talk to each other anymore. And that's severing several hundred million nerve fibers. It's quite a big deal. Now, the first, incidentally, remarkable thing about this is that people can live a normal life. Pretty much. It's just, you think that would just be totally extraordinary.
Seems impossible.
Yeah, you'd think you'd be two people who would just be fighting for control of your body or something weird like that. It just isn't. They can essentially live a relatively normal life, amazingly. But And so their IQ is pretty much normal. They can't drive because well, I'll come back to this in a second, but because there are issues about the connection between what you see and your actions, which are messed up by this. But most everyday activities go along fine. Now, the kind of trick that Gazzaniga wanted to look at, to explore, is to say, well, what happens if I present information into one half of your brain and ask the other half of the brain to make an answer about that information? And in fact, you can only do it one way around, because the area where the language centers are is the left. So there's an oversimplification, but most of the language, knowledge of language is in your left hemisphere. So this chunk here knows about the language, and this chunk here really doesn't know much. So if you're going to ask a question of any sophistication, you're going to have to expect a sensible answer. You're going to have to ask the left-hand side. So essentially what you do is you feed information to the right-hand half of the brain and ask the left hand to explain, to tell you something about that information. So the kind of thing that he did, and I'll see if I can give a clear explanation without pictures, see if this works, is he gave people cards with various pictures on them, and they had to pick matching cards which were somehow connected in theme, or rather the picture was on a computer screen, and they had various cards which would somehow thematically connect with the picture. But what he did rather cleverly was he split the picture in two. So you're looking at a computer screen, and on the left half of the computer screen there's one scene, and on the right hand half of the computer screen there's another scene. And because of the way the brain is wired, if you are looking in the middle of the screen, which that's what the participants did, then all the information on one half of the screen, the left going into the left visual field, that goes to the right half of the brain, and all the information on the right half of the screen goes into the left brain. The key point is, depending on where you put information on the screen, you can feed information to one half of the brain or the other. We don't have to worry about the details. Also, it turns out that the left arm and hand is controlled by the right half of the brain, and the right arm and hand is controlled by the left half of the brain. Again, the wiring doesn't matter. It's actually crossed over weirdly, as I've just indicated, but that's not important. So the point is that there's a way of putting information into one half of the brain, not the other, and there's a way of getting information out of one half of the brain or the other. So what he does is he shows people a picture of a snowy scene on one half of the picture, and on the other half there is a picture of a chicken. And so then asked the subject, can you point to some cards that fit thematically with what you're seeing, to sort of connect to it? And the half of the brain, the left half of the brain, which can see the which can see the snowy scene. Hang on, which way? Yeah. The left half of the brain, the language part, I think sees the chicken. Hang on, let's make sure I'm getting this the right way around. Yeah, that's right. So the left half, the language half of the brain can see a chicken, and the other half of the brain can see a snowy scene. And the two halves are asked to pick out some cards. And crucially, the half of the brain that sees the snowy scene picks a shovel. Okay, so it says, yeah, this one doesn't know about language, but it sees a snowy scene, so it picks a snow shovel. And then you say, so why did you pick a snow shovel? Now, of course, now the left hand of the brain, half of the brain pops up, because it's the one that knows about language. It's the right hand half of the brain that actually controlled the hand that picked the shovel. So it picked a shovel, and it picked a shovel because it was looking at a snowy scene. So you say to the left hand half of the brain, you say, yeah, why did you pick that shovel? Now, what it ought to say, what the brain should say, the left half of the brain should say, well, search me, I don't know. I was looking at a chicken. I mean, like, well, why would I pick a shovel? I just don't get it. But it doesn't do that. It actually says, oh yes, that's easy. I picked a shovel because you can use a shovel to clear out the chicken shed. Okay, so it's just like fantastic, and that's, it's not a nice latest example, but that's a typical case. So you've got a half of the brain is seeing its hand move towards an option. It's thinking, there's my hand going towards the picking the shovel, and there's a chicken. What's the connection? I know. I'm picking it because there's this I can use the shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Now that's telling you that the explanation you're giving, which is done fluently and easily and without any kind of sense of difficulty or uncertainty or hesitation, is being invented. It's not being retrieved by looking inside the mental processes that generated the answer. I'm seeing my arm move and I'm thinking, what's that happening? Why is it moving towards that card? And luckily, I can cook up an answer. But I don't. But of course, I must always be cooking up answers, because if I was only cooking up an answer in this case, I'd be uncertain. Because normally I just look at, if I could normally look up my reasons just directly, then I'd be thinking, well, normally I can look this up, but weirdly I can't today. I don't know why. I'll make something up. But no, it seems to be exactly as fluid and easy as anything.
Right.
So that's one case. That's a very extreme case, and I think actually that's the most convincing. Really, I think those findings are just amazing. And the creative ability to generate explanations for your own behavior, which really do not make any sense based on the information you've got, and to do it fluidly and quickly is a kind of clear sign that you're an amazing improviser. But the other type of experiment, of which there are many variations, but is something much less radical, which is some experiments by Petter Johansson and Lars Hall and colleagues. And this is a particularly cool stream of experiments, but there are many similar experiments out there. And what they do is they get people to make a choice, could be anything, choose between A and B, and then they play a magic trick on you, quite literally. So they fool you into thinking you chose the other thing. So they give you, say, two. Let's say it's there's a lovely experiment with jam. So you're in a supermarket, and they give you some jams to taste on little crackers, and they say, which is your favorite? And I think this is my favorite. It's this one here. And then they play a trick on me. They actually, in fact, they had to do this by having double-ended jam jars, which is rather nice. So one end of the jam jar has got strawberry, and the other end has got, say, raspberry. And so they flip over the jam jar. They give me some more of the jam. Says, why did you like this jam? Now, of course, it's now the wrong jam. So why did I? So there's the thing. Did you like A or B? A, yeah, A. I liked A. Then I give you some B, and I say, well, and of course I've tricked you to think it's the one you chose. Yeah. And I say, why did you like it? And now people will give you an explanation very happily. Sometimes they say, oh, no, that's wrong. That's a mistake. I didn't like that one. I got it wrong. But that's rare. Normally, they just give you an explanation perfectly happily. And they'll do this for political views. They'll do it for faces. They'll tell you why this is the face they prefer to that face, even though they actually prefer the other one. And they'll give an explanation which is based on things that are specific to the face they're looking at now. So they'll think, oh, I think she's got really, really nice earrings or something. But the person they chose actually liked more, didn't have earrings. So it must be that they're making it up at the moment.
Right.
So there's a whole so that's a sort of more slow, a less extreme example with people with intact brains, but it's the same story, really.
This is so interesting. Just a jam example. It suggests you're not accessing something deep internal. The taste you like, you're really relying on the external world to see which jam do you have in your hand, and you just remember you said the jam in your hand is the one you liked, and now you need to cook up an explanation to explain it, and this just means must be happening all the time. Just like you would explain someone who's walking towards a coffee shop as saying that probably she wants coffee. I guess you might do the same when you see yourself walking towards the coffee shop.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in fact, if you start to introspect too much about the experience of drinking a cup of coffee or tea or anything else, it's really kind of hard to know why you're drinking it. I mean, if you think, now, what is it about this flavor that I like? In fact, am I even enjoying it? It's really hard to say. Certainly, I've had that experience of thinking, if I really think about this, it's just really hard to fathom what it is I like about it. But I am in this habit. I mean, I do this. I've done it before. I'll do it again. But it's sort of wrong to think that the regularities in our behavior, the fact that we tend to drink, coffee and tea at different times of day and things like this, that these are driven by the fact that we really want those things. So it's easy, again, according to sort of a mind is deep perspective, you think, people have these preferences and they want to drink, they like this person really likes coffee in the morning, but they really prefer tea in the afternoon, or the opposite. But in fact, it's much better to say, no, they've really got a set of very narrow but improvised behaviors, which are always based on past experience. And past experience is normally, well, in the morning, they tend to do this. And so when they get up in the morning, they think, well, what should I do now? Well, I'll do what I normally do. If I don't think about it, I'll find myself making a cup of coffee and drinking it and thinking, oh, this is nice.
Yeah.
No, it is,
And
yeah. So,
and I guess that's why the way you were raised as a child ends up shaping so much of the patterns you exhibit as an adult. I mean, so many people say their childhood shaped them, what sort of parents they had, what sort of community they belong to. This just goes on to show that the paths that are laid early on in the brain, they end up influencing so much your future behavior, because your future behavior wants to be consistent with those
yeah.
paths.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. So I think, yes, I think the view that the mind isn't, in a sense, a deep, hidden, sort of totally consistent but mysterious entity to us, so that there's not some kind of hidden underlying self. But the idea that we're much more improvisational than that absolutely is consistent, exactly as you've said, with the idea that we're very strongly influenced by our past. We're sort of almost completely influenced by our past, because we're always improvising solutions to new problems based on old problems we've learned. If you imagine, trying to solve a maths problem, it's really very close. You're going to get nowhere if you've never solved any other maths problem. If you're thinking, well, I've never done any maths before, but let's have a go at this one, you've got no chance. The only hope you've got is that you've done you've solved lots of similar puzzles in your life, and now you can reuse pieces of those solutions and put them into different combinations and solve the new problem. And that's not true just for maths problems, it's true for everything. Now,
Right.
And of course that also, I think, should give us a sense of how we can change ourselves, but also how hard that is. So I think a good illustration, a good metaphor for how to change your own behavior is thinking about how we think about that in the context of something like getting better at maths, or learning the saxophone, or anything. I mean, so if you're going to learn a musical instrument, you can't just listen to a master of that instrument and think, well, I'll just do that. I'll just creatively leap from my current being useless at this instrument to being a master of it. You just can't do it. And you can't do it because you haven't got this incredibly, they have, thousands and thousands of hours of memories. And obviously they've got a very good ability to recruit and abstract those and mix them together in new and exciting ways. But you haven't got that, right? You haven't got that. But what you can do is deliberately try to acquire experiences and memories which will be useful to you. So when you're learning something, when you're trying to learn maths, or you're trying to learn music, or you're trying to learn anything, that's sort of what you're doing. The sort of process of education, it's the long haul, it's slow, is a process of shaping your own behavior. And of course, you can't do it perfectly, and you can't become a genius mathematician or a phenomenal musician from nothing. And maybe you can't do it at all, because it's not possible for us all. But you can really change your behavior a lot, and change your way of thinking a lot. And I think that also applies to more basic, more everyday things in our lives. If you think, well, how could I become more optimistic, or how could I become more have more belief in myself or something? These are not easy things, right? I'm not saying that they are, but the solution to that, insofar as there is one, is to try to take it step by step. To think, well, I'm going to try and think a positive thought right now. Or I'm going to think about, I'm going to concentrate on ways in which I've succeeded at something rather than failed over the next few seconds. And I'll do that again over the next few seconds, and I'll try to just change the general patterns of my mind. And it's very hard. And if your patterns are locked in a particular way, for example, if you have very strong patterns of anxiety or negative feeling or whatever, but negative interpretations of the world, it's really difficult. Really difficult to break out of that. But I don't think the problem is not a problem of thinking I suddenly need to change my inner self is wrong and bad or broken and needs to have to be fixed en masse. It's more like I've been playing badminton and I've now got a tennis racket in my hand, and all those badminton experiences are disastrous because I just have a tennis racket now. So I need to relearn. I need to relearn a new skill.
Yeah.
And I've kind of possibly taught myself the wrong way for the first time.
So I think, ultimately the message in your book is an optimistic message. That's what I took away from the book. That rather than, if you've never played tennis and you try to play tennis and you're bad at it, rather than thinking you were never meant to play tennis, which
Yeah.
assumes there is this aspect of a personality that doesn't align with playing tennis. You can always assume and see that you haven't had enough experience playing tennis, and that's why you're
Yeah.
bad at it. And but you can always change the amount of experience you gain, while you can never change the so-called aspect of personality if it's just
Yeah.
written in stone.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and that is a very optimistic thought. I think, it's very natural for us to ignore the incredible role of experience. When anyone can do something well, it's easy to think, "Wow, there's something special about them." It's not. I'm just not like that. But I think that's almost invariably. I mean, it's not that people are all genetically identical. We're clearly not. But the thing that makes people who do amazing things amazing is that they've spent their life learning how to do this amazing thing. And we can do that too to a degree. So I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's true at the very most basic level of kind of the way in which you interact with other people and the way you think about things. Yeah, all of these things can be to some extent self-trained, but it's hard. I mean, so it's not to say there's no sort of magical, you can turn yourself into anything you want to be kind of perspective here. It's because you're always working with the shaping that you've had, the experience you've had all your life so far. We're starting in different places. So I mean, a metaphor I rather like is thinking of ourselves as a bit like coral reefs, where each polyp on a coral reef is building on the previous ones. And you can't look at a coral reef and say, it's really in the wrong place, or I want a totally different shape. I just want to turn it into some other coral reef over there. That's my ideal of a coral reef, or at least that's kind of hopeless because you've got the reef you've got. It's growing up organically. Yeah. But you can, of course, at least real coral reefs don't have any autonomy. Of course, they grow under sort of the forces of nature. But you can try and build up one part of the mind and downplay another. You can reshape this thing, but you can't do it in kind of in tomorrow in a few days. And you also can't turn yourself into somebody else, and that's okay. But of course not. I mean, we're all like coral reefs. Each of us is unique, but each of us has some degree of control of how we progress, right. But a limited amount of control.
Yeah. So I agree. I mean, we are a bunch of patterns laid out in the past, and there is no hidden or deep self with desires and beliefs that's guiding our behavior. But there's definitely a feeling that we have a deep self, we have preferences, we have motives. So why is that? So why would, say, evolution make us feel the way that we have depth when there is no depth?
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting question. I think the answer to that is that what we're really trying to do when trying to understand ourselves is we're trying to create a story which will help us be coherent. And being coherent, we're inherently incoherent in the sense that we're just improvising along, solving the immediate problems in front of us. And like a novelist who's just writing, sort of line by line, we're inevitably going to make a mess of this thing from time to time. We're going to find, I said that person had at one moment they have a blonde hair, and now I've said they've got dark hair. Oh dear! So I didn't notice that, and there'll be more deep inconsistency. So if I'm drawing you a map, in fact, maps are great examples of this. If I draw you a map of some of my local area, so I want you to show you how to get to my house or something, and you say, "Oh, can you draw me a map of this other bit?" And then this other bit of your town, and then you put the maps together and say, "Oh, yeah, do these fit together?" The answer will almost inevitably, in fact, pretty much inevitably, be no. They won't do. The different bits of the map you have for your local environment just don't fit together. So we're always solving, and that's okay. We're solving, our conception of how our environment works is piecemeal. It's solved and encoded by us bit by bit, and the whole, if you put them all together, they don't really fit together. Now, I think a lot of the purpose of thought, conscious abstract thought, the kind of thing we're doing now, we're discussing, but also we do when we're kind of sitting quietly in the corners and pondering. What we're trying to do is to create more coherence in our lives. We're thinking, and what am I really wanting to do? I mean, I spent a lot of time doing this, and I spent a lot of time doing this thing, but which matters to me most? And the natural way to frame that question is to think, who am I really? What do I really value? Am I spending too much time working and not enough time with my family? So is it like I value work more than my family? Oh, that can't be right. So we kind of we're struggling with these ideas and trying to create a coherent whole. And I think it's easy. I think the illusion we fall into, but it's a very natural one, is thinking that process of trying to make ourselves coherent, which is very important, because if we don't, I mean, we are always going to be incoherent, but when we are, that will lead to, basically pulling in opposite directions, trying to achieve incompatible goals and trying to achieve the same goal in incompatible ways and so on. So we definitely want to be coherent. We want to resolve some of these contradictions. And it's easy to think that so we spend a lot of time doing it. I mean, that's really what thinking's about, I think. When you're trying, even you imagine thinking about something you're trying to understand, which could be psychological, or it could be something much more concrete. So it could just be something simple like, why is my washing machine broken or something? You're trying to think, well, there's water coming out here and there's wires waving around. Maybe that's got something wrong there. I mean, you're just trying to piece this all together. But just this process of trying to create a coherent story, it gives the impression when we're thinking about ourselves that what we're doing is not thinking, what story shall I live by? It seems more natural to think, what's the true story? So if you're trying to repair your washing machine, there's kind of a true story. There's kind of a story about why is it broken? You don't know what the answer is, and you fiddle around. You may not get to the answer, but you think there's a true story about this. I just don't know what it is, and I'm trying to figure it out. When you're thinking about yourself, it's easy to have the same perspective, to think, well, I've got all these contradictory desires and feelings, and so what are the real ones? What's the real story here? And I think the right way to think about it is to think, what story would I like? What's the story I prefer? What would I want to create now? And when we talk about making up our minds about things, and this is a really helpful phrase, actually, we often don't reflect much about it. When you're making up your mind, you're making it up now, right? It's not that you're discovering your true preference. You're making up your preference in the moment. You're making it up like you're making up a story. And I think that it's a weird way to think, actually. I think it's very much more natural to think that we're uncovering when we're actually creating. And I think another tiny side to this, perhaps, would be that I think most of us really massively underestimate the creative power that we all have. We tend to think, well, I can't be creating the story of my life, or I can't be creating answers to questions in the moment, because I'm just not that kind of creative, and it's just not me. I mean, I couldn't do that. Some clever person, some brilliant improvisational comic, they could probably do this, but I certainly couldn't. And that's totally wrong. I think we're all unbelievable improvisers. That's sort of all we do, really.
Right.
And when we realize how good we are at it becomes less puzzling.
I think this is a really good way to look at what are we doing when we are asking who am I, rather than assuming that we are accessing some true deep self or trying to access it. We're simply choosing between different alternatives, and those alternatives could be inconsistent, and you obviously have to choose one, otherwise you'll get pulled into different directions, and that may not be evolutionarily, I mean, that's either physically not possible or evolutionarily not efficient. So this illusion is I mean, it's more of a choosing rather than discovering. Right.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, if you were asked to write a novel, no one thinks. I mean, we do say things like, I think I've got a novel in me, but nobody thinks, I really have got a novel in me. I don't know what novel it is. If I can find out what it is, that would seem bizarre. I mean, everybody realizes that you've kind of, when you're writing a novel, you're kind of inventing it as you're going along. And when we're living our lives, it's sort of it's even more obvious, really, that we're creating ourselves as we're going along. It's only by a remarkable sort of mental trick that we think, oh no, that's not right. No, there's some deep me. I'm not just inventing this character. I mean, similarly, if you imagine thinking about improvisation or acting, so you're doing some kind of drama exercise where you're told to play the role of I don't know. Some historical figure, or you're supposed to play the role of somebody who's been in some very difficult situation, and you start trying to do this, and nobody thinks as the drama progresses that you're discovering who this person really is, because there is no person, or you're just making them up. But oddly, when you come out of the drama exercise and become yourself, we have this feeling, oh, well, I'm not making things up anymore. This is just me, just being me. And I think that's really underplaying our dramatic skills. I mean, we're in the drama all the time.
Right. Since we're getting to the close of our conversation, I wanted to discuss the aspect on subconscious, where you write about there is no such thing as subconscious. And I think it conflicts with, again, people's intuitions, where many geniuses of the past have talked about how they got very creative solutions in their subconscious or unconscious. So I wanted to pick your brains, particularly from the point of view of architecture of the brain. You do talk about it.
Yes.
How the architecture of brain illustrates that subconscious cannot exist. So can you talk about what can we learn from the brain architecture, particularly in context of conscious or subconscious?
Yes. So I suppose there's sort of one sort of very, very key point, which is that if you look at the way the brain works, well, the first thing about the brain is that when you're doing most complicated tasks, much of your brain is active. So it's not the case that I've got a kind of dedicated graphics card and I've got a dedicated sound card and so on, which are all doing different things. And the brain is it does have specialisms. So certainly, visual cortex is all at the back of the head, and you've got the motor strip running down the side of the head, which is controlling the body. So there are areas of the brain which have sort of functions which are somewhat narrow. But if you're doing something complicated, like having a conversation with somebody, most of your brain is active. That's the first thing, but not all of it. And the second thing is that the way the brain is working is in a very sort of massively parallel way. So the whole, hundreds of millions of neurons are going to be in action. In fact, the total number of neurons in the brain is about 100 billion. The estimates vary, but so in a normal cognitive task, it's going to be hundreds of millions of neurons active, and they're active in sort of big cooperative networks. Now, the thing about the way those networks work is that if you're solving one particular problem and the vast network of nerve cells is engaging in that problem, if you try and give it the same kind of problem, which will involve the same network at the same time, you're just going to get horrendous interference. And indeed, artificial neural networks that people use in machine learning have exactly the same problem. If you're using this kind of big cooperative network style of calculation, then you can only really do one thing at once with the same hardware. So putting those two things together. So the first thing is, when we're doing something complicated, large areas of the brain are active, and the second is that when those areas of the brain are active, they can only do one thing. So they can't. The hardware is taken up. This big network of neurons is sort of all jiggling around and they're communicating with each other. If you try and get them to jiggle around and communicate with each other about a different problem, they're just going to get into a tremendous tangle. So that means there's going to be a tremendous bottleneck in the way the mind works. So for example, to give you a sense of how extreme the bottleneck is. So if you take something like, if you do something like flash up, let's look at the world around me now. If I can see you, I can see myself on my screen, I can see the screen of the computer and lots of icons and the room and so on. Now, I say that, but I'm sort of slightly wrong. I'm giving the impression that I can simultaneously see all of these objects, but actually the evidence is that essentially I'm only able to actually recognize as an object essentially one. This is slightly arguable, but I'm going to go for one object at a time. So if I'm looking at you, I'm kind of vaguely aware that there's another face on the screen somewhere, and that's me. But if I'm looking at you, my face is just kind of not really a face anymore. It's a kind of blobby moving thing. And then those icons at the bottom of my screen, what are they? Well, they're just some shapes. I was going to say colored shapes, but they're not even colored shapes, because if they're far enough, they don't have to be very far. If they're far enough away from you on my screen, I can't even see them as colored, because the color vision drops off very quickly unless you're looking right at something, you can't really see it in color. So the weird thing is that even though my impression is that my brain is able to see many things at once, actually this bottleneck problem means that actually I can only really recognize one thing at a time. And so even if I look at a person, I might say, oh yes, but if you look at a person, you can see many things. You can see the eyes, nose, and mouth, and shoulders, and so on. But even that's not really right. If you focus on somebody's eyes say, then the rest of them is kind of disappears and is not being properly encoded, and so on. So that might seem extremely weird. You think, well, surely the brain is not so limited that it can't encode the many objects at once. But actually, that seems to be right. And people who have a disorder called simultagnosia actually experience this. So what they seem to struggle to do is to disconnect from a perception of one object and move to another. So if I'm looking at somebody's glasses, I'm looking at my own glasses, say, if I'm looking at myself on the screen, then if you have simultagnosia, you may struggle to disconnect from the glasses and then look at the eyes or look at the face or look at the picture on the wall. And so you get stuck. And when you get stuck, what you say things like, I can see a pair of glasses. Anything else? No. Oh, you suddenly say, a head. What about the glasses? Oh, the glasses, can't see the glasses. And so you have these amazing, there are some wonderful YouTube videos on this where you have someone with simultagnosia being presented with various objects. And there'll be something like, they'll be, say, presented with, say, a fork and a knife. And they'll say, I see a fork. And the knife is crossing the fork. No, just a fork. Oh, a knife. Can you see the fork? No, the fork's gone. And then they'll suddenly say, there's a particularly lovely one where somebody suddenly says, oh, I can see some writing on the blackboard. So suddenly everything else is gone, but the writing on the blackboard has appeared. So you just have this, what we're actually doing, and what this, I think, really reveals, is that what we're actually doing when we're looking at the words, we're sampling little chunks one at a time. Now, this looks like a long diversion, but it isn't really from our thought about neural architecture, because this is telling you that the brain is actually really a sort of sequential system, a sequential machine, because it works by using these very densely connected cooperative networks of units, which can only solve one problem at a time. Then our conscious experience, even of the visual world, is actually our ability to analyze the visual world is actually sequential. I look at one object, then another object, then another object. Or in fact, if I'm reading a text, roughly speaking, you're sort of seeing one word at a time. You're not really seeing all the other words. When you're looking at one word, the other words are basically gone. That's too simple, but I talk about that a bit more in the book, but that's broadly right. Now, when we think about it like that, we realize that, of course, if I'm thinking about one complicated thing, or a fairly simple thing, then I clearly can't be thinking about another complicated thing at the same time. So if I'm some great scientist, such as Henri Poincaré, trying to think about some deep scientific problem, and Poincaré said a lot about the subconscious, about his own experiences of the subconscious. But of course, for my money, Poincaré, though a great genius, has no more ability to have insight into his own behavior, his own mental processes as anybody else, although obviously he's a remarkable genius, no doubt about that. But when you think about Poincaré thinking about his mathematical problems, thinking about a mathematical problem is going to, if you put someone in a scanner, be lighting up all kinds of bits of the brain. There's huge amounts of stuff going on there. So if you're like going on a bus journey and just staring out the window and watching things go by, you're certainly not thinking about a mathematical problem at the same time without being aware of it. Because if you're doing some other complicated thing, you're interpreting the unfolding scene around you, you're definitely not doing a second complicated thing at the same time, because you can't even see two objects at once. Right. I mean, it's just another extreme example of how limited our memories are is memory retrieval. So how sequential we are. So there's an experiment by two colleagues at Warwick, Greg Jones, Elizabeth Mailer, and myself, in the late 90s, I think it was, where we gave people the task of retrieving two types of things. So they could either retrieve, say, it's city names, or it could be, I can't remember what the other example was, but say it's colors. It wasn't colors. You say, think of as many colors as you can, think of as many cities as you can. So in one version of the experiment, you just do this separately, colors and cities. I can't remember, it wasn't colors. What were animals? Maybe it was animals. So I do animals and cities. And in the other version, you just say, just think about either animals or cities. It doesn't matter which, just produce as many as you like. Now, you might think if we could contact our memories independently, in parallel, we could think, well, I'm struggling a bit with the animals, but luckily the cities are coming through. The cities are running out of cities, but some animals have come through. So you'd be quicker. You'd be quicker if you could search for these independently. But that's not true at all. Essentially, what people are doing, we see in the data, is they're either thinking about cities, or they're thinking about animals, or they're thinking about cities, and they go backwards and forwards. But nobody ever can actually search their memory for two things at once. And so even at the most elementary level, recognizing two objects at the same time, or having two memories at the same time, you can't even do that. And just as a final example on the visual side, there's a wonderful experiment by University College London, where I used to be, by John Driver and many colleagues. Very clever experiment where they present people with words and pictures right on top of each other in different colours, and they're both perfectly distinguishable. It's a little line drawing in a word, and you can read the word, or you can recognise the line drawing. And they gave people a task which required them to focus on the line drawing in one part of the experiment anyway. And they looked to see whether or not the brain area that lights up when you read a word was present or not. Was that activity? Was it active? So normally, if I flash a word, you'll see a little bit of activity in the visual word form area of some kind. But if you have this task of saying, "What's that picture?" or "Have you seen that picture before?" And the word is, and you're looking at a picture, but therefore your eyes are focusing right on the word. You're looking right at the word. Visual word form area, nothing. Just nothing happening. You can't read a word and recognize a picture at the same time.
Yeah, but sometimes we get the answers or solutions out of nowhere because our brain sort of does this not multitasking, but switching one after another, and when it revisits a problem, it starts from a slightly different and a new point of view. So the probability of solution increases.
Yeah, that's very well put. Yes, exactly. So I think the reason we have the illusion that we've been subconsciously thinking about something is that when we come back to something, sometimes it's obvious and it wasn't before. And the way to think about that is that when you're searching in your memory, you're searching in a space of problems, is a bit like searching for an object. And the trouble is, if you're looking in one place and it's not there, you just keep looking in that place and thinking, no, I can't see it. But if you've done something else, you come back, you're looking in somewhere in a different place and think, oh, there it is. And the illusion is thinking, the subconscious told me where to go. Whereas mostly, the subconscious just jiggled you around a bit. So when you come back, you're doing something different and you look somewhere else. And mostly it doesn't help. Sometimes it does help.
Right. So this brain architecture suggests subconscious doesn't exist, but it also suggests that multitasking is impossible.
Yes.
But we do seem to do some activities in parallel, like driving and talking or eating and watching. Is that because some of the activities just get wired into patterns in our brain? So just brain hands it off to those patterns?
Yeah, I think there are two phenomena there. So one is exactly as you say, that when you are dealing with very basic things, so either things that are biologically wired into us, such as things which are concerned with sort of eating and balance and so on, although they're still things we have to learn, of course, they can be dealt with by particular sections of the neural machinery which just don't interfere with the others very much. Right. So I think that's one thing. And you certainly do find that people who have spent their life, doing touch typing, or if they're concert pianists or whatever, they can do. They can do amazingly complicated typing or piano playing and do other stuff. It's just astonishing. But that's not that they can do their chosen task at a high level. They can play a very familiar piece they know very well. If you say, now I want you to play something new or to do something very expressive and beautiful, then they have to concentrate. Then everything else shuts down. But yes, it is possible. It does seem to be possible to take complex tasks and to compile them in a way that some specific bits of the brain seem to be engaged and quite a limited amount, so that all the other bits of the brain can get on and do other things. But that is relatively the rare case, I think. Now, mostly when we think that we're able to multitask, thinking about, for example, talking and driving, what we're actually doing is a lot of switching. So there's some lovely experiments by Hal Pashler, who's a very, very ingenious cognitive psychologist, looking at this attention at the UCSD. He's endless interesting experiments, which all basically show, how amazingly limited the cognitive system is, and yet how clever it is at covering up. But one of his experiments, which I think is beautiful, is an experiment where you're doing a simulated driving task on a computer screen. And you just have to brake from time to time. You're following a car in front of you, and you just have to brake if it starts to slow down. and I think maybe its brake lights come on. So it's a really familiar task. If you've driven a lot, this is really, really not a hard task. But if you have to do any other task, however simple, then it really messes up your braking tremendously. So, for example, if there's an occasional noise, and you have to report that whether the noise was a high or a low noise, and you're reporting it verbally, so you're not using a pedal, and you're listening for the noise, you say, high tone, low tone, high tone. If there's a high tone and suddenly the car in front of you starts to slow, your braking will be screwed up. Or if it isn't screwed up, you won't be able to answer the question. So you can't do both. You've got this. It seems like, oh, I'm chattering away, I'm driving along, but as soon as something happens in a road, which is complicated, wham, all conversation stops. Or if it doesn't, you're in trouble. So actually, there's much more interference than we're aware of, and it gets back to our sort of improvisational abilities. Really, we're amazingly good jugglers between tasks. And we're so good at it, we think, oh, I was doing those I was doing several of those tasks at once. But what you're actually doing is, it's a bit like when you're spinning plates, you're not really spinning multiple plates. You're spinning one plate and then going to the next plate, then going to the next plate. And the fact that we're very good at that is, that gives us the illusion that we're actually doing a task simultaneously.
I think that's how even the older computers that had only one core did multitasking. They would just quickly switch between programs, but you would get the illusion of multitasking as a user. So
yeah, absolutely, yeah, and we're doing that, but much more slowly. Yeah.
Just last two questions, very quick answers. One is when you talk about a person who is generally known to be a better thinker or a more creative person, what is that person doing differently from others? And I'm asking in terms of if listeners can take any advice if someone wants to become a better thinker or a creative person.
I think I've got one piece of maybe two pieces of advice on this. I think one piece of advice is that to have interesting ideas, you need to spend a lot of time struggling with difficult ideas. You need to spend a lot of your time struggling with things you don't understand, and trying to figure them out. So it goes back to this practice thing. So to have something interesting and new to say about anything, you have to spend a lot of time trying to have interesting new things to say. But of course, most of the time, what that feels like is just being confused. Right. You just think, I just don't understand. I don't know what I'm trying to do. I don't know what someone else has done. I don't know why it worked or why this doesn't work. And it's just that. But they're spending a lot of time not running away from that, which I think is a lot of us have a natural and understandable tendency to think, I'm getting nowhere here. If I'm confused, if I don't know what's going on, I'm getting nowhere. I should do something where I can make better progress. Whereas I think to have creative ideas, you have to spend a lot of time in that state of confusion, because occasionally there'll be some connection that you do make, and then that will that will actually be helpful. So I think the first thing is don't try to think about how to solve tricky problems or to understand tricky problems. And don't give up. Now, don't worry if you don't solve them, because most creative problems don't get solved. I mean, most of us don't solve most problems. All we have to do is solve the occasional problem, and that's fantastic. So the first thing is stay in that space and don't worry about don't move out of it. And the other thing, which I think is good general, in some ways very obvious advice, but certainly this applies especially in the academic world. But I think it applies to the broader environment as well. Is that it's really useful to know something nobody else knows, or know a combination of things that nobody else or a few other people know. Now, it doesn't mean you know more, but you just know something different. So if you're going to have a creative idea, it's really hard to have an exciting creative idea if you know the same things as everybody else, because all the obvious clever ideas, they've had them. They know the things that you know, and they've been thinking for years, decades, maybe centuries. So they've had those ideas. So you've got no chance of coming up with anything new. But if, on the other hand, you know things from one place and another place, and very few people have ever been in those two places, then quite likely there's some cool stuff that can transfer, and you might find it because no one else has been looking. Right. And that doesn't have to be, as I say, I think it's very applicable to research, where it's really useful to know, not to know a lot, but just to know things combinations of things other people don't know. But I think it's probably true for sort of innovation, entrepreneurship context too, actually. Right. I think often, that's the way forward. It's being different.
I think in a way, new ideas is simply making unexpected connections, because I mean, literally, you can't invent something new out of nothing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
your contribution could really be exploring things together that haven't been explored together before.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, finally, to close out with, where do you stand on this debate on free will, given that
Mm.
your book talks about, it has this flavor of determinism. And I do know the answer depends on what level you're talking about. But I'm curious, how do you
Mm.
view free will?
Yes. So I have a simple answer to this question, which is sort of out of proportion to the depth of the problem, really. But it goes back to, I think it's a much older idea than this, but I picked this point up from Quine, the philosopher, where he says, and I think, as I say, I think this goes back before Quine, that the freedom of the will is freedom to do as you will, but it's not freedom to will as you will. And I think that is a crucial insight. When you realize that our wills are free if we are able to do as we will. So if I wish to do something and I can do it, I'm not tied down. I'm not somehow coerced, or someone's got a gun to my head. Then that freedom of the will is the ability to do the things you want to do. But what we tend to think is, oh no, that's not enough. I need to be able to be free to will as I will, to actually want to do the things I want to do. And I think that is just an incoherent idea, which doesn't make any sense. So I think we have this sense that we want something more. But the thing when you think about what that other thing is, that ability to want the things you want, it's just kind of nonsense, really. So I think the free will question is a bit of a shallow question. At least I want to give a shallow answer to what may be a deep question.
Great. This is a really good end to our conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Nick Chater, once again for talking to me. Again, I'll highly recommend all the listeners to read this book, The Mind is Flat. I loved it. I made notes, and of course, this conversation was a really interesting outgrowth from all the ideas from the book. So you'll learn a lot, you'll enjoy a lot. So highly recommend the book. Thank you again for taking your time.
Well, thank you very much, Paris. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Okay, bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.